More than a century ago, the United States acquired the rights to buy the land for, build and operate the Panama Canal. It was built from 1904 to 1913 and opened in 1917. Anti-US riots in Panama in 1964 triggered the renegotiation of agreements in 1967. Eventually, in 1977, leaders of both countries signed two new treaties, the Permanent Neutrality Treaty and the Panama Canal Treaty, collectively known as the Torrijos-Carter Treaties, after former US President, the late Jimmy Carter, and then Panama leader General Omar Torrijos. Finally, on December 31st, 1999, the US transferred control of the canal to Panama. Professor Yuan, let me come to you. Can you explain to us how these two treaties worked? They were worked out, by President Carter, and what did he want to achieve with them?
The treaty was negotiated and signed and agreed upon during the time the United States faced daunting challenges strategically, during which time the U.S. was about to recognize the PRC. On the one hand, also, he faced a military strategic challenge from the USSR. So that was the time the U.S. under Jimmy Carter wishes to, select an alternative path to secure the regional peace through negotiation instead of the military dominance. So that was the background for such a agreement be negotiated. So there are aspects including to transfer of control of the canal and the restoration of sovereignty. Those are the ABC for ordinary states, but that was the first time ever that the hegemon dealt with the junior partner in such a way, nice way, a diplomatic achievement of the Jimmy Carter. However, Donald Trump criticized heavily about this, about Jimmy Carter's diplomatic legacy recently.
Yeah, I mean, Vincent, do you think that Carter, if he was living today, president today, would he do the same thing? I mean, obviously, things have changed since then.
I think it was actually, if you look at sort of the events that were taking place in the late 70s, well, in the lead up as well, I think part of it was based out of necessity. Like, they looked at the Panama Canal, and I mean, the Panama Canal is long. I mean, it's 80 kilometers long, the total length of it. I mean, a lot of it's just undefensible. And you already had the protests that were taking place across Panama at the time. You had students charging into US fortifications. You had US soldiers die. You had scores of students die. And I think there was this understanding at the time, or at least this feeling at the time, that if something was not done about this sovereignty, that you would see these prolonged clashes and you would see US administration over the Panama Canal become tenuous at best and chaotic at worst. And I think it's hard to make a decision now in 2025 and looking back at this situation in the 1970s and try to say whether Jimmy Carter made the right or wrong decision.
And in terms of, obviously, you talked about a Taiwan contingency, the great power play. At the moment, Carter didn't have those threats.
Of course.
Nothing so great as what China is. Professor Yuan, so you talked about the Neutrality Treaty, which was that US shipping would be guaranteed and that US would be permitted to use armed force to keep it open. Can you tell me what you think was behind Trump's comments about Chinese soldiers being stationed there? And also whether there's a connection to his first soundbite that we played, which said that the canal was built for the US military.
Sentimentally speaking, I think on average,
is it only sentimental, though?
No, this is,
right.
On the other hand, strategically, if one were to take into account the practice, the military practice of the PLA of recent years, they developed somehow a very, very interesting and cunning, if not critical, gray zone practice. In the case of the worst scenario, as I said at the very outset, recent episodes suggest something happened in Suez Canal, the derail of disruption it would create it for the normal passage. So I think as I said, it's highly plausible, okay, in case of emergency, and because it's a very narrow canal, it's now open ocean, so to guarantee the free passage of the normal route requires 100%, control of all the scenario, which is very unlikely as we speak. That is why I think the Donald Trump's assumptions are legitimate, but we require further negotiation with the respective authority.
So Vincent, would there be any basis? We all know that Trump has threatened to take back control. Given everything that we know, neutrality treaty, would there be a basis for the US to reassert control?
I think, to be honest, it'll be very hard. But I think we have to look at Trump's comments in the context of this, which is that we've seen sort of these comments that people have labeled kind of really out there and really, really forward-leaning, and perhaps too kind of whimsical in the past. And I mean, certainly he's been in government for 4 years. We've seen, his comments on different issues that people have put one or another label on. But I think what normally happens, if we look at kind of this in hindsight, is that he says something, yes, that is quite far-fetched. That is quite, I think, out there. But you ultimately create the conditions for a negotiation of something that is feasible and doable. And people all of a sudden see, because it's all relative to earlier comments, now this new proposal suddenly becomes much more serious and much more, I think, realistic. And as a result, I do think that we can perhaps imagine that this is setting the stage, these comments about taking control, whether military, economic coercion, taking control over the Panama Canal, as setting the stage of a renegotiation of either treaty or agreement or even something commercial between the United States and Panama that would, number one, perhaps reduce commercial shipping rates for U.S. companies, which would be, I think, directly passed on to consumers in one sense, and perhaps economically speaking, a win for Trump. But also, number two, guaranteeing passage of perhaps naval vessels and perhaps even being able to push back against Chinese operations, China's control over ports in the vicinity. So I think what all of this really is setting this stage for a set of negotiations that will probably take place after Trump takes office.
Right, and it also appears to be a warning to the Chinese, given that part of the neutrality treaty, which is that the US will be permitted to use armed force to keep it open, as you mentioned.